Nuclear Weapons Freeze Campaign by Sanderson Beck. We are the curators of life on Earth, standing at a crossroads in time. We must awake from our false sense of security and commit ourselves to using democracy constructively to save the human species. Helen Caldecott. To end the danger of nuclear war, the nations must not merely freeze nuclear weapons, but abolish them. Randall Forsberg. At the same time as the nonviolent direct action movement was growing, a nationwide campaign in the United States for serious nuclear arms control developed a groundswell of support through the bilateral nuclear weapons freeze proposal. The freeze was conceived in the summer of 1979 when the American Friends Service Committee, AFSC, proposed a nuclear moratorium. An arms control scholar, Randall Forsberg, who had done research for the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, wrote the essay, Confining the Military to Defense as a Route to Disarmament, in which she suggested that both the USA and USSR stop producing nuclear weapons as a first step. This idea struck a chord with leaders in the peace movement when she spoke at the Mobilization for Survival annual convention in September. Encouraged by them, she wrote up her proposal in a 4-page call to halt the arms race. The following paragraph from that document was to become the basis of freeze resolutions all around the country. To improve national and international security, the United States and the Soviet Union should stop the nuclear arms race. Specifically, they should adopt a mutual freeze on the testing, production, and deployment of nuclear weapons and of missiles and new aircraft designed primarily to deliver nuclear weapons. This is an essential, verifiable first step toward lessening the risk of nuclear war and reducing the nuclear arsenals. The AFSC distributed 5,000 copies, and endorsements soon came in from clergy and laity concerned, CALC, FOR, WILPF, Pax Christi USA, and the Coalition for a New Foreign and Military Policy. Republican Senator Mark Hatfield introduced in the U.S. Senate an amendment to the SALT II Treaty calling for a freeze, and in January 1980, a conference of about 30 peace groups endorsed Forsberg's freeze proposal. The freeze resolution was placed on the ballot in 62 cities and towns in Massachusetts, and in November it passed in all but 3. The freeze even passed in 30 where Reagan also won. More than 300 peace activists met at Georgetown University in March 1981 and set up committees to work for a nuclear weapons freeze. Forsberg's Institute for Defense and Disarmament Studies, IDDS, became a clearinghouse for information until the National Nuclear Weapons Freeze Campaign, NWFC, established an office in St. Louis in December 1981. That year, freeze resolutions were endorsed by the legislatures of Massachusetts, Oregon, New York, Connecticut, Maine, Minnesota, Vermont, Wisconsin, Kansas, Iowa, and Maryland. In November, 300,000 West Germans demonstrated against nuclear weapons in Bonn, and the Women's Pentagon Action involved about 1,300 women in civil disobedience. In February 1982, Jonathan Schell published a detailed analysis of the consequences of a nuclear war in the New Yorker magazine, and his book, The Fate of the Earth, came out in April and became a bestseller. Senators Ted Kennedy and Hatfield introduced a freeze resolution in March 1982 and immediately attracted 25 co-sponsors in the Senate and 125 in the House of Representatives. Although 60 to 85% of the American people favored a freeze, pressure against it from 2,000 corporate lobbyists led to its narrow defeat in the House on August 5th by a vote of 204 to 202. However, in the 1982 elections, nuclear freeze initiatives were passed by the people in California, Massachusetts, Michigan, Montana, New Jersey, North Dakota, Oregon, Rhode Island, Chicago, Denver, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and Dade County. For the first time in history, as many as 18 million people voted on the issue of nuclear weapons. 60% of them voted for the freeze, even though President Reagan opposed it. In 70 congressional races where the freeze was a key issue, pro-freeze candidates won in 64% of them. On May 4, 1983, the U.S. House of Representatives passed a non-binding freeze resolution 278 to 149. A bilateral nuclear weapons freeze that is verifiable was a fair proposal at that time because the Soviet Union had just recently caught up to parity with the United States in military power. Yet the Reagan administration was attempting to forge ahead to military superiority again by developing and deploying new first-strike weapons such as the Trident II, MX, Pershing II, and cruise missiles, which actually had been approved by President Carter in December 1979, shortly before the Russians invaded Afghanistan. A complete freeze would also be a comprehensive test ban and would be easier to verify than SALT I or II, according to Herbert Scoville, former Deputy Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. Common sense told people that the arms race had to be stopped before it could be reversed. The freeze campaign became a national mainstream issue, and much of the effort behind it came from professional organizations, such as the Physicians for Social Responsibility, PSR, which was led for 4 years by Dr. Helen Caldicott. In her care for children's health as a pediatrician and as a native of Australia in the South Pacific, where many nuclear tests occurred, Caldicott became aware of the medical dangers from radioactivity and worked to end French nuclear testing there. Her lectures, films, and books on nuclear madness stirred thousands of anti-nuclear activists. In 1979, she organized a symposium of experts on the subject of the medical consequences of nuclear war, which addressed large audiences in major cities across the United States. A short film showing the highlights of the symposium called The Last Epidemic was shown by peace groups and freeze advocates to thousands of small groups. Another short film of one of Caldicott's moving lectures on the nuclear arms issue, If You Love This Planet, won an Academy Award in 1983. Caldicott is not afraid to use strong and deep emotions of concern for the survival of our human civilization in order to stir her listeners to action. She considers this issue of human survival to be the ultimate issue of all time. In 1980, she started the Women's Party for Survival, with the symbol for it being a baby. Later, her driving force turned this into the many groups that sprang up around the country called Women's Action for Nuclear Disarmament, WAND. Her work also stimulated the forming of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, IPPNW. And in the fall of 1982, they presented a television program that was shown uncensored in both the Soviet Union and the United States. 3 Soviet physicians and 3 American physicians all agreed that the only cure for nuclear war was prevention and the elimination of nuclear weapons. An indication of how widespread and diverse the peace movement had become can be seen by the various professional organizations that sprang up so rapidly. They included Educators for Social Responsibility, Lawyers Committee for Nuclear Policy, High Technology Professionals for Peace, Lawyers Alliance for Nuclear Arms Control, Union of Concerned Scientists, Business Executives for National Security, Architects for Social Responsibility, Social Workers for Peace and Nuclear Disarmament, Union of Concerned Psychoanalysts and Psychotherapists, Artists for Survival, Nurses for Social Responsibility, and many others. Religious and church groups became more active than ever. the U.S. Catholic bishops, the World Council of Churches, the United Presbyterian Church, the Episcopal House of Bishops, the United Methodist Council of Bishops, the National Council of Churches of Christ in the U.S. that includes 30 Protestant denominations, and many other churches, including the Lutherans in East Germany, made strong criticisms of the nuclear arms race. Even though polls showed that 3/4 of the American people favored freezing the testing, production, and deployment of nuclear weapons, half-hearted support by Democratic presidential candidates and Republican victories in 1984 and 1988 delayed the cessation of the nuclear arms race. Even after the end of the Cold War and major reductions in military spending by Russia and the other former Soviet republics, American politicians still refused to reduce U.S. nuclear arsenals and weapon technology that would have provided a valuable peace dividend. Yet, in stopping the accelerated arms race by leveling it off, helped to bring about the economic prosperity of the late 1990s. In 1986, the Nuclear Arms Freeze Campaign, NWFC, merged with SANE to become SANE Freeze, and in 1993 the name was changed to Peace Action. As of 2005, Peace Action was still actively working on many peace issues, including abolishing nuclear weapons. In July 1996, the World Court ruled that the threat or use of nuclear weapons would violate international law. In May 1995, the Abolition 2000 Statement was initiated, and 400 organizations signed on. In 1997, a treaty was drafted for the abolition of nuclear weapons, and it was introduced into the UN General Assembly. In 1998, Jimmy Carter, Mikhail Gorbachev, Helmut Schmidt, and Pierre Trudeau were some of the 120 leaders from 48 countries who issued an appeal to abolish nuclear weapons. By the year 2000, the Abolition 2000 campaign had more than 2,000 groups, and the petition had been signed by 13.4 million people. In 2002, Dr. Caldecott published The New Nuclear Danger, warning about the revived military-industrial complex under George W. Bush. And that year, she founded the Nuclear Policy Research Institute. She described how the Clinton administration had greatly increased arms sales to other countries, and she noted that despite the end of the Cold War, it was the first administration since Eisenhower that did not negotiate a major arms control treaty. Under George W. Bush, the Department of Energy embarked on the Nuclear Stockpile Stewardship and Management (SSNM) program that would cost more than $5 billion per year. Since the Cold War was long over and the U.S. had no enemies for which these new weapons were needed, she wondered what could be the motivations of the tremendous project. The explanations she found were the enriching of weapons makers, rival competition between the Air Force, Army, Navy, and Marines, donations to politicians by weapons manufacturers, and giving the United States a huge arsenal to enforce its corporate globalization. Caldecott was concerned because the new Bush administration withdrew from the Anti-Ballistic Missile (ABM) Treaty so that it could go forward with its Ballistic Missile Defense (BMD) or National Missile Defense (NMD) system that had been promoted for years by the new Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. She noted that both President Putin of Russia and the Chinese Arms Control Ambassador warned the United States that this acceleration of the arms race would stop the process of nuclear disarmament. Policy statements had made clear that in its drive for world domination, the Bush administration is intent on gaining military supremacy in space. Representative Dennis Kucinich has proposed a bill to prohibit the weaponization of outer space. Caldecott also warned about the radioactive depleted uranium, DU, that was used in Iraq in 1991, Bosnia in 1994 and 1995, Kosovo in 1999, and Afghanistan in 2001 and 2002. She discovered that already at least 5 Italian soldiers who fought in Bosnia had died of leukemia. Caldecott reviewed the records of the warmongering advisors influencing Bush's foreign policy: Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, and others. At the beginning of her book, she contrasted these horrifying dangers with the vision of a wise president leading the world toward disarmament and peaceful recovery. Randall Forsberg was appointed by President Clinton to the Advisory Committee of the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, and she continues to work diligently for nuclear disarmament. She noted that the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 flagrantly violated U.S. and international laws. At the same time, the United States was justifying its invasion with the erroneous contention that Iraq still had remnants of chemical weapons. The U.S. was blocking and undermining treaties that would verify the reduction of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. Forsberg has pointed out that in 2001, Russia proposed reducing its arsenal of 10,000 nuclear weapons to 1,500 with verification of their dismantling. But President George W. Bush refused this offer, and in May 2002 signed the Strategic Offensive Reduction Treaty, SORT, that merely put thousands of weapons on reserve instead of dismantling them. The limits do not take effect for 10 years, at which time the treaty expires. Bush made the U.S. the only country to block the implementation of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. The Bush administration has also blocked verification of the ban on biological weapons with the excuse that they would expose the secrets of the biotech companies. The U.S. has refused to ban weapons in space and is the only country developing such weapons. President Bush also announced that the U.S. was withdrawing from the Anti-Ballistic Missile ABM Treaty, which had been in effect since 1968. In 2004, the Bush administration began deployment of ballistic missile defense, BMD, even though the system has failed most of its tests. According to Forsberg, the Bush team reversed a policy aimed at getting North Korea to end its testing and export of missiles with a range of more than 200 miles. And China will not negotiate on fissile material unless the U.S. is willing to discuss its program for weapons in space. Information from the Nuclear Posture Review has leaked out indicating that the Bush administration is threatening to use nuclear weapons against several countries, including Cuba, Syria, and Iran. Forsberg believes that these Bush policies are more likely to foster the spread of weapons of mass destruction than the reverse.